I wanted to make sure I got you all the rest of the differentiation lecture. If you recall, when we first started talking about differentiation, we focused on the content and making sure that you're presenting the material to the students in multiple ways. And the second part that we didn't get to was the process. And so the process is these are the activities where students are starting to interact with learning, and where students are starting to practice the skills and starting to interact with the knowledge that you've given them. So some of the things that you can do within this part of your lesson plan is scaffolding and levels of questioning. So making sure that you're taking the time to break down skills and task analyze, which is looking at every individual skill or piece of knowledge involved with the larger skill that you're teaching the students. You can also vary your levels of questioning, and this requires you to create questions ahead of time. So in your lesson plan that you're working on, you're already doing that because you're scripting it out. But making sure that you're thinking through the types of questions that you're asking so that you're able to meet all of the students' needs. So some of your students may need more lower level questioning at this time in the lesson, and everyone can benefit from those hearing the answers to the lower performing, the questions for the lower performing students. But you should also plan to make sure that you have questions that are for your higher performing students too. So you will, as you're starting to have students interact with the information, you're going to ask basic definition type questions or basic step type questions. What's the next step? But you can also, for the higher performing students, ask questions like, why are we doing that? Or what if we did this instead? What would happen? Or what are some possible errors that could be made at this time? Right, so making sure you're building in all of those types of questions when you're starting to have students work with the information. Also, just doing a model lead test and making sure you're giving different models, including lots of examples and non-examples, making sure that you are using continuous assessment or lots of active student responding is key in this area so that you're meeting all of your students' needs. You can sometimes use group work. I know a lot of people tend to do this now. And within that group work, you're providing the differentiation. So there's different types of group work. You can do a homogeneous group where students are all basically at the same level as the person in their group, or you can split all of the students up. So you may have a group that has a higher performing student, a medium performing student, and a low performing student, and that might be the heterogeneous grouping that you're doing. Within each group, you need to make sure you're assigning roles so that everyone knows what their role is and what the clear contingency is. So yes, you put them in a group, and yes, you give them a task, but making sure each individual student has a task and make sure that they know on some level they are all responsible for that information. So making sure you're telling the group, maybe at the end you're going to say, I will randomly select one person from your group to share the answer that you got. And that the fact that you're doing random selection means that every student is going to need to fully understand the problem. So that makes sure it sets up a clear contingency for all of the students to pay attention and all of the students to truly make sure they understand the information. You can also assign different activities for each group, or you can give groups choices. Those are all ways to differentiate. So if you're going to use group work, that would be one example of differentiation, but you'd have to be very specific in how you're designing those groups. Another example of differentiation is journaling, partner talk, literature circles. So the reason why this is differentiation is because within group work, there's typically the collaborative aspects where some students find that easy, some do not. With journaling, that gets at all of the students who are not comfortable sharing things aloud. Partner talk is for students who may not be comfortable sharing with a larger group, but may benefit from being able to talk through answers, and having them talk with a partner is much more intimate and something they could be more comfortable with. Right, so these are all just examples of what you could use. So going back to the beginning, within your lesson plans that you are currently working on, you need to plan for at least 2 ways that you're differentiating. So you could be using scaffolding. If you are, make sure you note where you're using scaffolding of a skill. That would be one way to differentiate. A second way would be to level your questions that you're asking. And this would need to be noted. That's the second way. A third way would be using model lead tests with continuous assessment. You should be doing that anyway because that's what the lesson plan assignment is based on. Group work is another way that you can add in differentiation. Journaling is another way. Partner talk is another way. Literature circles, that's another way too. So do you see how all of these examples of differentiation are getting at different types of learners or different comfort levels of learners? All right, and then the last thing you need to differentiate is the product of your lesson. So if you have a very high quality objective, that tells you what your assessment is or your product will be. So whatever your assessment is, you need to make sure that you're allowing for some differentiation. And this can look like a lot of different things. Some examples be having students do group work versus individual work. So giving an option of group work, giving an option of individual work, giving students the option to orally present something versus a written presentation. And so even if you have something like an exit slip, you can still give students the opportunity, instead of writing the answers, you can say, if you're more comfortable telling me the answers, bring it up, and I will read the questions to you, and you can answer me orally. So that gets at students who may struggle with writing a little bit or who may just be better at explaining themselves verbally. Can involve technology when possible. So if students have a Chromebook and you're going to ask them to open up one of the apps that we learned in 410, if you're going to ask them to answer some questions on there, then give them the option to also write the answers down too. Anytime you can give students options, it's better. So that way students have a choice, and choice is always good for motivation. Make sure that in all of these areas that you consider student strengths, because everyone has strengths, and I think we often hear play to the student's strengths, teach to their strengths, but to me that's dangerous, and that we're neglecting weak areas sometimes. So to use a sports analogy, I as a player was very strong with my right hand and very weak with my left hand. So it would be easy for my coach to just say, hey, stick her on the left side of the floor, because then she can use her right hand to go into the middle of the floor. So that's one way to approach it. Or it could be, hey, let's stick her on the left side. However, during practice, let's make sure we're giving her a ton of drills working on her left hand, which is what would be appropriate in that situation. So you can certainly keep in mind student strengths and utilize that knowledge, but don't ever neglect